I'm David Belcourt. I spend a lot of time in a Gilded Age mansion. The house is called Belcourt. It's off the famous Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. Built for a divorced bachelor in 1895, it has been recently restored and has a fascinating history. This is another session with Harle Tinney. Harle moved into Belcourt in 1960. She married into the family that bought this house starting in 1956.
Coming to Belcourt was a long drive, and Bellevue Avenue was a mess. But if you drove down the avenue, there would be some very well-kept estates, and then there were horrible messes. The sidewalk sometimes had 3 feet of grass on it. And that was not fixed until 1992 or 1989 to 1992.
So people come to Newport. They basically hung out on Thames down by the waterfront. Were there stores and things to do down there?
It was a Navy town, and there were bars, and there were bars, and there were more bars
in that area, right?
There. And,
so this was kind of a forgotten end of the island.
Well, Bellevue Avenue was still occupied by the widows of many of the summer colony. For example, the story of George Hull is fascinating. Now, his wife was the granddaughter of General Pearson, who owned the house on the corner of Bellevue when it makes that big turn. It's called Roselawn. And he was in the summer colony, belonged to Bailey's Beach. See, the Tinneys owned Seaverge, and they bought that from Mrs. Payton Van Wreller.
Next to Rough Point?
Next to Rough Point. But Rough Point had been unoccupied basically since 1936. And Doris Duke was young. She came to Belcourt, as you know, in 1955 when the Lorellards had it for the Jazz Festival. And she was with, I think, Jimmy Cromwell at the time. But Donald was 21 years old. Seaverge was a birthday gift to him on the 18th of May in 1955.
That's a heck of a birthday gift.
Well, for him it was, but the whole family bought it. It was 4 people that bought it.
And so where were they living before Seaverge?
Cumberland.
What did they do at that house? They sold that farm and that house?
That's a long story. It's part of my story. But my father-in-law and mother-in-law, Harold and Ruth Tinney, loved the Cumberland property. And it had 28 acres. They had horses. My mother-in-law took care of the Lincoln Downs horses when they had the racetrack. And they would break those horses to the point where they were crippled or whatever, she would restore them. And that was one of the things that she did. She restored their confidence, and then they could give them to other people or have other people take care of them. But my mother-in-law, her love from the time she was 12 was horses. And they had a big sadness. One of the stories in her life, which is probably one of the most emotional that I wrote in that book about Ruth Tinney, was the day she had to say goodbye to Turkish Gold, whom she'd had for 25 years.
Wow.
And she thought that that horse could come to Newport. He was fine, in a sense, 25 years old, but he was strong, a white Palomino.
This Palomino?
Yes, Turkish Gold.
They're planning to take it to Newport to Seaverge?
Yes. They were planning to take it to Newport to Seaverge, and they had enough acreage to let it out, but they were traveling back and forth to Cumberland in those days.
Oh, my goodness.
In their Woody, the 1947 Plymouth, which we still had when I was here.
But that's not an easy... First of all, that's an amazing car. Second of all, That drive is not easy in 1955.
It was horrible. It was over the Mount Hope Bridge, and it took an hour and a half. And when you came on the island, it was West Main Road, which was as narrow as East Main Road is now. In fact, it was more narrow.
Sure.
And there were all farms on both sides. So by the time they got to downtown Newport, Broadway, it was in horrible condition. After the First World War, the servant population all joined the army because they got paid.
Yeah.
And when they were out of the army, if they came back healthy, that was one thing. Now, I mentioned George Hull. George Hull was an officer in the First World War in the trenches in France. And he was gassed.
Oh, my gosh.
So he had only one lung. So he and his wife lived over at across from Rough Point. It was on the corner there, Roselawn.
Roselawn.
When Donnie and I were going together, before we were married, he invited me to go over with him for tea. And the Hulls had tea every day at 4 o'clock.
Cool.
I was amazed. I was, 18, 19? And George Hull said, "How do you like your tea?" I said, "I drink it black, sir." He said, "You'll take it with milk and sugar." Whatever you say.
Yeah.
And
can't argue with a guy who's been gassed.
No,
right?
but he was then in his late 80s.
I mean,
his
that's amazing
wife
that he
was
lived that
90.
long.
That's the amazing part. His sister was the richest woman in the country at the time. He had money, and they maintained the house, but he only had 2 servants. He had a man who drove sometimes and who maintained the grounds and mowed the lawns, and he had his French maid, who was also 80 years old. She made cookies every day and did the serving, and she maintained that whole house by herself. It was probably only 25 rooms, but it was...
only.
Well,
crazy. What was Seaverge? How many rooms there?
Seaverge had about 30 rooms, and that was the story of Mrs. Payton Van Wreller, another fabulous story of the summer colony. She was in her 20s. Payton Van Wreller was separated from his wife, who had their children, and she was married to him. She was 22 and he was 60. And
wow.
They had a year on his yacht as a honeymoon. It's all in the newspaper of the New York Times. When they returned, he had retained the apartments in New York City of the Van Rensselaer fortune, which was one of the original New York settlers when it was a Dutch colony. It was quite a few years later. We're talking about 150 years or more. It was very short time after they ended their honeymoon that he died.
Oh, no.
And left her all of the real estate.
Including Seaverge.
No, she bought originally by Elbridge Garry, who was the great-grandson of the signer of the Declaration of Independence.
John Hancock?
Well, Elbridge Garry was one of the signers.
Oh, I got you.
And he built the house. He was an inventor, and it's all about the women. I can't remember why, but the deed left Elbridge Garry, and it went to Edward V. Hartford, who started the A&P Company. And Edward V. Hartford was Claiborne Pell's wife, Nuala Pell's grandfather.
Oh, okay.
He was a composer. And when the Tinneys bought Seaverge, they bought it furnished with everything in it.
Okay. Which is where they get their loads of things that they bring here.
Actually, they had more in Cumberland because they were antique dealers in Cumberland.
Okay, so in Cumberland, they're antique dealers. They now sell this house, right?
Well,
do you remember Seaverge?
Yes.
So you had been there, but because you come into this house.
Well,
was Seaverge still around?
I didn't see it while they were alive, but Jerry Taylor, you mentioned Jerry Taylor.
Oh, yeah.
He
Rest
had
in
all
peace,
the
Jerry.
pictures.
Great photographer.
Yes. He had all the pictures of Seaverge, which I still have.
Oh.
And, of course, I lived with Donald Tinney, and Seaverge was like his 21st birthday present. Don't tell me that he wasn't a thrilled young man.
He must have loved that house.
Oh, absolutely.
Was it hard for him then to sell it, to move here?
Well, the Charles Gifford West, who was the real estate person, knocked on their door every single day. They had planned to stay there because Mrs. Van Rensselaer had written a contract with them to hire a room in Seaverge. She was in her 80s at the time, for the summer. And that money that they would have had from her would have paid for the house eventually, the taxes and the mortgage. And she was only going to be there 2 months out of the year. But my mother-in-law was going to take care of her, be the caretaker for her. But she died in January. And now things changed for the Tinneys, and they still owned Cumberland. And they were traveling back and forth twice a week or more from Cumberland to Newport in their old Woody station wagon.
So they actually owned both the houses.
They owned both. And they had 28 acres in Cumberland. A developer offered them money for it, but my father-in-law and mother-in-law didn't want to sell that house. They wanted to keep it. It was one of the most historic houses in Cumberland on Angel Road. They named it Faraway Meadows, but it was owned by Daniel and Ruth Wilkinson. And Daniel Wilkinson was the head loomsman for Slater Mill in Pawtucket, which is a fairly famous...
Yeah, it's the birth of the Industrial Revolution.
Basically. But Daniel Slater was the investor and had the money, but Wilkinson was the person who did the work and set up the looms and did a lot of inventions for them. So he built this duplex house on Angel Road. And it was called Angel Road because the Angel family, Jim Angel, was a special person. The Tinneys got to know him a little bit, but as they got to know these people, they were older. They were in their 80s and whatever. And if you were in the 80s in 1950, the medical situation was not the way it is today. You were either healthy or you died. It was as simple as that.
Yeah.
And remember, the Tinneys were young. They were farmers. They had a collection of horses. They raised pigs. They raised chickens. And Donnie told me about their Killer Rooster that was the guard for their house. They'd let it out in the yard, and if anybody came, the rooster would come out there and spur them if they got out of the car. And so
it's good protection.
They would have to scream from the car and say, "Help!" And
so
somebody
some people
would
have
come
dogs
out.
to
And
protect
some
your
people
house.
have dogs.
The
but,
Tinneys had a rooster.
Well, they had dogs too,
Oh.
and they had cats.
But the rooster was the...
But the rooster would attack anybody who came onto the property.
Nice.
My mother-in-law eventually said, "We have to get rid of that rooster. We're going to have chicken stew."
Nice.
And she put it in. She said she boiled that rooster for hours, and it was so tough you still couldn't eat it. But anyway.
Okay, so they moved down to Seaverge. What shape is Seaverge? Oh, okay. Let me back up. One thing I just wanted to make sure I have right in my head. The Tinneys rented a room at Seaverge for the summer, or Mrs. Rensselaer still wanted to spend time there?
Both.
Okay,
Yeah,
so they
Mrs.
were
Van
basically
Rensselaer
working.
offered them.
They were working with her,
Yes.
and were going to take care of her. But then she died,
And then she died.
and then the house was given to them.
No, they had to pay for it,
They had
and
to
they
pay
had
for it.
already paid for it.
Oh, okay,
The Tinneys were very successful antique dealers in Cumberland.
Cool.
Their property of 28 acres was on the border of the monastery, the
Oh, that's right.
Cistercian monastery, where Nine Men's Misery.
That's right.
They owned half of it, and the monastery owned the other half of it. And Donnie, as a little boy, used to go down and play there with his cousins.
That's cool.
But the monastery burned the year that Donald graduated from St. Dunstan's, 1950. They only had one sister that could talk. His name was Blaise Drayton. Drayton Hall in Charleston.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Blaise's mother was an interior decorator for the White House.
Wow.
They were very well connected, but Blaise wanted to be a monk. So he joined the monastery. He had graduated from architectural school, and I'm not sure which one. But he befriended the Tinneys because they were next door, and he could talk.
Huh.
I remember as a new
Blaise
bride-
Drayton, the talking monk.
He was the only one that was allowed to talk. They were the silent. They took a vow of silence to join that Cistercian monastery, and there were about 50 monks there when Donald was growing up in Cumberland. And
Interesting.
he would hear the medieval music and the bells that would ring for prayers and all of that. And as a little boy, he would go out and watch the monks work silently in the fields, which were right next to his property.
Huh.
But he was awed by Brother Blaise, who came to the house often because he was an interior decorator. His mother was an interior decorator, and the monastery inherited a lot of furniture from the people who were wealthy and gave to the Catholic Church. They gave it to the monastery. A lot of it needed restoration. The Tinneys were the finest restorers in Rhode Island at the time.
Oh, wow.
They worked for the Historical Society in Providence, and my father-in-law was extremely skilled in all kinds of woodworking. My mother-in-law painted, did gilding, and she also was a teacher of early American decoration.
Wow.
And she had a collection of students in the Cumberland, Providence area, and she would go from Newport once or twice a week to teach her classes.
Wow.
And
Busy
then-
family.
Well, they were busy all the
Yeah.
time, and they were productive. My father-in-law taught Donald how to do all kinds of wood carving, and he was an incredible woodworker. My mother-in-law was the artist, so Donald had this artistic family. When he graduated from St. Dunstan's, he didn't want to go to any other school. He was only 16. It was ninth grade.
So he was a high school dropout?
Yes, long story about Donald, but he was a reader. He read everything. His mother was exasperated when he'd be reading with a flashlight under the covers in the bed, pretending he was asleep. And he would read all night, but he developed a knowledge of history that was, in my humble opinion, unequaled, much like you do research. But what you have today is called the internet.
Yeah.
They had books, and he had to go to the library in Providence, which was a long drive from Cumberland, but they drove him to school every single day, summer and winter. But he got very poor grades because they couldn't get there all the time in the winter. So he was absent, but he was in the choir. They sang at Grace Church, St. Stephen's, St. Martin's, and did all kinds of music.
Graduates ninth grade.
He graduated
go
from the
back.
ninth grade, and he didn't go back to school.
So for his teenage years, was he homeschooled kind of?
Well, he learned on his own, but he
Wow.
was working in the shop.
Huh.
He did all kinds of things, and he collected.
Huh.
The first thing he bought when he was, I think he was 12, he bought a chair. And he paid $5 of his own money for it because his aunt and everybody would give him birthday presents, and a lot of times it was a $1 bill or 50 cents or something. But he saved it all up, and then he bought a chair.
What
and
kind
it
of chair?
had a broken leg. So he and his father fixed it. I still have that chair. He paid $5 for it.
Huh.
He also then bought a little organ that, because he played the organ, he studied at St. Dunstan's with Ralph Harris and Fred Kronheimer, and he was the assistant organist for Fred Kronheimer when he was in high school. He was in the 8th grade, 9th grade, in the organ. He had all kinds of exceptional talents in music, and he was a boy soprano, but he never sang again after his voice changed. Today, or when I asked him to sing, he wouldn't, except one time.
Yeah?
Low G. He'd go down into the tunnel at Belcourt, and he would hum the low G, and that was exactly the sound of that tunnel. And it was like being inside an organ pipe.
Pardon my ignorance, but what's a low G? Can you give me one?
Well, I can't sing it because I have my...
Is it high? Like,
It's low. No, it's
like that?
It's very low.
No.
Right, but when you go into the tunnel, well, what you have today is you could create that with an audio thing.
So
but
the tunnel is still on the property.
yes, it is. And the tone of that was, and I can't guarantee that it still is, but it was the low G, which was a G below middle C. And if you're not a musician, you won't understand those terms, but if you are, you understand. And I was a musician, so he took me down in the tunnel before we were, while I was learning the tour, and he said, listen to this. And he
Low
could
G.
sing that low G, and wow, it went right through you.
Wow, cool. Now I want to go in the tunnel.
You own the tunnel now, and if you...
I'm bringing back the
if
Donnie
you
low
can
G.
If you can sing the low G...
I don't even know what a low G is. No, I'm not a musician. I'm a cameraman, so I'm the
Well,
opposite.
if you sing at all, which you can, you might start
Thank
at
you, Harley, for that.
middle C and do the scale low and keep going down there. I don't know whether you have that bass voice. You might be...
I don't think I do, but
You
I'm
might
willing
be
to give it a try.
baritone or a tenor, but you have to have a special low bass. You know what I'm talking about.
Morthy, I don't think Morthy has a low bass.
Probably not.
No, he has a
No,
higher
you
voice.
have, again, and that's why when you ask me to sing it, no way.
Yeah,
The lowest
interesting.
note I can go is to C below middle C, and that's...
So
That's
Donald,
hard.
backing up to Donald again. Donald, he buys a chair. He buys this organ.
And he was doing antique trading.
And the family, so he jumps right into the family business.
Yes.
Age, what are you in ninth grade? 14?
He was 16.
16. So, I mean, he really, he is the Tinney business. Like, he is being groomed to continue.
Absolutely,
the Tinney
and he
tradition.
loved it.
And he loved
And
it.
he was also into the farming, but,
What did he think of Bellcourt then when he saw it
well,
for the first time?
they didn't want to buy this house because it was in such terrible condition.
Really?
Charles Gifford West showed them many of the houses. And before I even knew Donald existed, Brother Blaze had brought the Tinney family to Newport, introduced them to Newport, because he knew all of the owners of the mansions who were getting mature. And a lot of those ladies would make donations to the monastery. Many of them were Roman Catholics. And even if they weren't Catholics, they would donate furniture and things to the monastery. The monastery couldn't use it all, especially certain paintings. So Brother Blaze would take it over to the Tinneys and have it restored and then sell it for profits to the monastery.
Oh, wow.
So the Tinneys, as I said, were the finest restorers in Rhode Island at the time. They got an incredible reputation. They were paid well. They could afford to keep Donald in St. Dunstan's. And my mother-in-law's teaching to many people whose husbands were bedridden or had difficulties after the war, the wives were almost crazy. That's why I wrote the book, Ruthie, it's called. But it's...
Was she a tough woman?
It depends on your definition of tough.
Okay.
Resilient is more like the right word because she was very kind. She loved animals more than people. Kind of sounds like Oliver Belmont. And yet, when she married my father-in-law, Aunt Nellie owned a farm in Charlemont, Massachusetts, with 300 acres. They built a barn. Aunt Nellie and my mother-in-law, just the two women, built a barn. And the farmers that lived around there called them the farmerettes. And they laughed at them because they were women. My mother-in-law's grandmother kept the house. Aunt Nellie was in business and had to commute to Greenfield or Pittsfield. And my mother-in-law managed the farm. They had 10 head of Holstein cows. And she sold milk to Hood. And she had to milk them by hand. They didn't have a machine. We're talking the 1920s. And she was only in her 20s at the time. But she was strong, and she gentled horses. And the men all laughed at her when she bought a horse and paid really money for this big German draft horse named Major, who bit everybody. And the farmer that owned Major said, I'm going to sell it to the farmerettes. Ha, ha, ha. They'll quickly get rid of that horse, and I'll make my money. Well, my mother-in-law gentled that horse. Took her about 6 months to stop that horse from biting. And so when they built the barn, that horse would go up into the hill, and they'd cut the big oak trees. The horse would bring it down to the road, take it about 4 miles to the sawmill, and they planned all the lumber, had it milled, and built that barn. And the barn is still standing.
Really?
It's on Route 2. I think the last time we were up there, the name that they painted on it was still there.
Going back to, so they did not want to really purchase Belcourt.
Not on the first viewing. They did ask
because
for
of the amount of work that...
second viewing. Well, the only room that Donald thought was even redeemable was the ballroom.
Right.
Fell in love with the stained glass, which much of it was broken. And
Really?
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of, I mean, we look at, we're in the ballroom right now, and the stained glass is like perfect, it seems.
Well, yes, and that's how we got into the stained glass business, because the Tinneys called around to find somebody that could fix the windows in Belcourt, and J. Gilbert Dudley had the only stained glass business left in Rhode Island at the time, And I remember after we were married, in fact, we went to see it during December. We were married on December 2nd, and we went up to see the studio because the stained glass restoration was one of the first things, or one of the things they wanted to restore. But when they came into Belcourt, they came in through the ledge row door, and then they walked into the library, and it smelled like a garage.
Yeah, right. Because the stables were a truck depot.
Yes.
For many years.
Exactly. And George Waterman stored antique cars. And when they looked at Belcourt first, there was a Stutz limousine and another car in the stable. And they didn't know whether those cars went with the house or not. And they never did find out, but somebody took them. Huh. And that was all right.
So there was no, when Ruth came here, there was no idea for horses, though. She didn't want to rebuild the stables and bring horses back to Belcourt?
No. Once they decided on buying Belcourt, they had the best stable, what had been the best stable around, but all the partitions had been smashed down by George Waterman. The stable was, you could stand at the one door and look to the other side, and the just tiles were missing. The whole thing was a mess, and it was filthy.
It seems like the stables never really got restored then, because they were ruined by the Navy.
We made it into a stained glass studio, and so yes, we restored the stable. We cleaned everything. The tile walls were sparkling. We made a gift shop in the east end of the stable.
Okay.
And everything was spick and span and beautiful. But
by 2012, what was the stable? The stables seemed like it was just storage at that point.
Yes, because we left the stained glass business in 1989 after my father-in-law died. We were busy at Belcourt, and we had parties, and I was getting older. My mother-in-law and Aunt Ellie had passed. She passed in 1972. My mother-in-law was taking care of my father-in-law, who was now in his late 80s, and she was 5 years younger than he, but she was occupied taking care of him. She did a fabulous job taking care of him. And then when he died in 1989, after Alzheimer's for 2 years, I had been put...
Must have been hard on Donnie.
Well, it was very difficult, but I can tell you a funny story. My father-in-law, when he had the Alzheimer's, got fixated on his deer head that he had shot when he was in his 20s. And he kept saying, we'd sit at dinner, "Where's my deer head?" "Dad, it's right over your head. Just turn around and look up there." "Somebody stole my deer head." I mean, it was over and over. One day, Donald got so exasperated by his repeating that and us doing it over and over again. And I kept saying, "Donnie, it's the disease. It is not your father.
Yeah.
That's the disease. This is stuck. His brain isn't right. He has a disease that affects the brain." And so Donnie was going to throw something my father-in-law had thrown something at Donnie when they had an argument. And Donnie was going to throw something back at him. So he picked up this beautiful Majolica, very rare fish, which was a pitcher. "Going to throw this." He looked at it, put it down, and picked up a 5-cent ashtray and threw that. He was not a happy camper that day, but
my goodness.
Then we all laughed.
Yeah.
You know, we said...
Broke the ice. Broke the tension.
Well, and I tried very hard to calm the situation because as a young sort of medical student, I understood that there is a disease. It's called Alzheimer's, people aren't the same and their personality changes.
Did it happen to your husband?
He was in the beginning of it.
Oh, no.
And he was diagnosed with Lewy bodies. It's crystals that are forming in the brain. And when Donnie was very little, at the age of 3, he had a brain injury that nobody discovered until he was 30.
Oh, my goodness.
He had headaches every day.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons he didn't want to go to school, was because he had a headache all the time. And no matter what he did, his head was aching. When we took him to the doctor, then they did a brain scan. Doctor said, "Here's a newspaper. Can you read this?" He said, "Yes." "You don't have the part of the brain that can read. How did you learn to read?" That injury when he was 3 years old had stopped the growth of his frontal lobe.
Oh, my goodness.
But my mother-in-law patiently, while he was a little boy, taught him to recognize every word as a picture. You know how we read letters and you pronounce them and you look at it that way. He could read the letters, but to put a word together, that part of the brain was missing.
So he had like a learning disability on...
He had a great disability. Today they would call it dyslexia, but his was physical. However, he could never read music, but if he heard a piece once, he could play it.
Wow.
His teachers were surprised, but he was a very fine musician. He composed a lot of music. In fact, my mother-in-law said when he was 3, he composed a little piano piece called Moonlight of Shade, and he was 3.
Interesting.
So music was in him.